Hey y'all, my voice is acting up a little bit, so I'm sorry, but I'm Quinn. Welcome back. That's not how it goes. Today, we're gonna talk all things sizing on the Sentro. Oh my god, that was a sound. So I have been getting a lot of questions about sizing on the Sentro, and they kind of fall into two different categories. So I guess category one is how do I adjust sizing on the Sentro? And then category two is if I am a larger size, can I make garments that will look good and will fit me on the Sentro? And we're going to talk about both of those things today. I will answer both of those questions in as much detail as I can. So let's just get started. So the way that you adjust sizing is you need to make a gauge swatch, and then from your gauge swatch you'll see how many stitches and rows it takes to make like a 4-inch square, and from that you'll find the measurements that you need to make whatever it is you're making. So this is a gauge swatch. I just made this last night, and don't worry, we'll go into how to make a gauge swatch and all that, but I just wanted to explain a little bit what it is first. So a gauge swatch is just a little swatch of fabric that you make on your Sentro, and you need to make it in the way that you're going to be making your finished product. So if you were going to do like different stitches or like different stitch patterns, stuff like that, with your finished project, then you need to do that on your gauge swatch. You also need to make sure you have the same tension between your gauge swatch and your project, and you need to wash your gauge swatch in the way that you will wash your finished project. So everything that you're gonna do to your finished project, do that to your gauge swatch. Oh, well, and also, yes, of course, you need to use the same yarn. So let's go through how to make a gauge swatch. Basically, all you need to do to make a gauge swatch is to make a swatch of fabric that is at least 4 by 4 inches and preferably larger. I usually like to cast on at least 20 stitches to get that measurement. You don't need to use waste yarn, and you can have your machine in the tube or panel setting. It doesn't really matter. Knit as many rows as you need to get your swatch to be at least 4 inches long, and make sure you're using the tension that you want to use in your finished project. The reason why we want our swatch to be at least 4 by 4 inches is because 4 by 4 is the typical measurement that you take to get your gauge, and taking a smaller measurement can give you an inaccurate gauge. So it's just best practice to make at least a 4 by 4 inch square. It's actually good to make your swatch a little bit larger than 4 by 4 though, because the edges of your swatch can be unreliable for measuring just because your stitches can get a little weird on the edges. So it's just good to make your swatch a little bit bigger, just so that you can get the most accurate measurement possible. And I'll show y'all how to measure the gauge once we're done making our swatch. So once you have enough rows, then just cast off and give your project a little stretch to get those stitches in place. This is what your swatch will look like after it comes off the machine. You need to wash it and let it dry first before you try to measure it though. If you try to measure it now, you won't get an accurate gauge. The panel is all curled on the edges, so it would be difficult to get a measurement anyways since it won't lay flat, but your gauge can also change after the fabric has been washed and dried. So we need to wash this first, but I already have an identical swatch that has been washed and dried, so we're just gonna move on to that one. So let's measure our gauge. You'll want to try to measure in the middle of your swatch if possible, since the edges can be a little unreliable. It's also better to measure with a rigid ruler rather than a flexible ruler, but use whatever you have available to you. So we'll measure our stitches first by placing the ruler at the edge of one of the stitches. Make sure you're lining up this first line here and not the edge of your ruler with the edge of the first stitch. And then just count how many stitches there are in these 4 inches. So I have 14 stitches within these 4 inches. Next, we'll measure the rows, so just turn your swatch and do the same thing. Place your ruler in the center of your swatch and make sure this line is lined up with the edge of a row, and count how many rows are in those 4 inches. So I have 20 rows. So with this yarn on my Sentro, with the tension that I used, to get a 4 by 4 inch square, I would need 14 stitches and 20 rows. Alright, so we have our gauge, but what do we do with it? I wanted to bring y'all through two separate examples of how to use the gauge measurement we just found to figure out how many stitches in rows we would need to make a simple sweater. So we'll be doing this with two different sizes, but we're going to start with a size medium. According to the Craft Yarn Council's website, a size medium has a 36-inch bust, 28-inch waist, and 38-inch hip. So let's just say we want this sweater to measure 38 inches around and 17 inches long. And the sleeves will be tubes, which according to our gauge would measure about 13.7 inches around, and we want the sleeves to also be 17 inches long. Now that we know what we would like the measurements of our sweater to be, we need to figure out how many stitches in rows we need to get those measurements. Really, we're just going to be doing some math, and you can do this in a lot of different ways, but this is the way that makes the most sense for me and my brain, but I wanted to put it out there that this isn't the only way. To start, I like to find how many stitches in rows there are in just 1 square inch according to this gauge. To find how many stitches there are in 1 inch, we need to take this stitch per inch measurement, which is 14 stitches per 4 inches. So that's 14 stitches divided by 4 inches, which equals 3.5 stitches per inch. Now we can find how many rows there are in 1 inch. 20 rows divided by 4 inches equals 5 rows per inch. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, we can figure out how many stitches in rows we need to get these measurements for this sweater. We'll start with the bust measurement, which is 38 inches around. This is technically a width measurement, so we'll be trying to find how many stitches we need. So we'll take that stitch per inch measurement we found, which is 3.5 stitches per inch, times 38 inches, which equals 133 stitches. My sentro only has 48 pins though, so I can't cast on 133 stitches, so I need to divide this number to figure out how many panels I'll need to equal 133 stitches. Dividing this number between two panels won't be enough because 133 divided by 2 is 66.5, which is still too many stitches for the machine, so let's try dividing it by 4. So 133 stitches divided by 4 panels is 33.25 stitches per panel. The last thing we need to do is round that number because we can't make a quarter of a stitch, so we'll round down to 33. Since we already know how many stitches to cast on for the tube, it's 48 because that's how you make a tube, we can move on to figuring out the row measurements. So if width is stitches, then length is rows. Both the length of the body of our sweater and the length of the sleeves will measure 17 inches. So we only need to find the number of rows once because it'll be the same number for both the sleeves and the body. We'll take that row per inch measurement we found earlier, which was 5 rows per inch, and multiply that by 17 inches, which equals 85 rows. And now we know how many rows, stitches, panels, and tubes we need to make a medium-sized sweater according to our gauge. So to recap, we need 4 panels that are each 33 stitches wide and 85 rows long, and 2 tubes that are each 85 rows long. Now I wanted to bring y'all through one more example, so we're going to find that same information but for a size 2X. According to the Craft Yarn Council, a size 2X has a 48-inch bust, 40-inch waist, and 52-inch hip. We want our sweater to measure 50 inches around and 18 inches long, and we want our sleeves to measure 18 inches around and 18 inches long. So we already know how many stitches per inch there are with this gauge, so we'll use that same number to find how many stitches we need to equal 50 inches around. 3.5 stitches per inch times 50 inches equals 175 stitches. Just like before, we need to divide this number because we can't cast on 175 stitches on the sentro. Dividing by 2 gives us 87.5 stitches per panel, which is still too large for the machine, so let's divide by 4 again. 175 stitches divided by 4 panels is 43.75 stitches per panel. Now we'll round that number to the next nearest whole number since we can't knit a portion of a stitch, and we get 44 stitches per panel, and we need 4 panels. Now we can figure out how many stitches we'll need for the sleeves. For the size 2X, we won't be making a tube on the sentro, we'll need to make 2 panels and sew them together to get the correct measurement. So we want our sleeves to measure 18 inches around, so 3.5 stitches per inch times 18 inches equals 63 stitches. which is too large to cast on as one panel. So we'll divide that number by 2 and get 31.5 stitches per panel, and then round that number to 32. So 32 stitches per panel, and we need 2 panels for each sleeve. The last thing we need to figure out is how many rows each of our panels needs to be. Both the body and the sleeves will measure 18 inches long, so we only need to find this number once. And we'll use that same rows per inch measurement that we found earlier. So 5 rows per inch times 18 inches equals 90 rows. So again, to recap, for the body of the sweater, we need 4 panels that are each 44 stitches wide and 90 rows long. And for the sleeves, each sleeve will be made up of 2 panels that are each 32 stitches wide and 90 rows long. So that's how you use your gauge measurement to figure out how many stitches, rows, panels, and tubes you need to make whatever project you can think of. So in theory, you can definitely make garments on the Sentro for larger bodies, but how about in practice? Well, the answer is yes. You can. You're just going to have to make more panels and join them together. I know some people won't love having to join all those panels together. Some people won't love the way they look, but there are a lot of different options for joining panels together, especially ones that make it look a little bit more invisible. So typically when I make a sweater, I make 2 panels for the front and 2 panels for the back, and then tubes for my sleeves. And because of that, I have to have a seam running right through the middle of the front of my sweater and a seam running right through the middle of the back of my sweater. And there are more obvious looking seams than others, but my personal favorite is fairly invisible actually, which is why I like it so much, but it's not very stretchy. That's the only issue that it could cause in your projects. I don't know the name of it. I keep trying to find the name of this and I cannot find it anywhere, but I recently did a tutorial for how to do this joining method that I don't know the name of. So I can link that for y'all in the description if you want to check it out and use that joining method. I'm gonna go grab a piece that I've made where I've used that joining method. Okay, so this is a sweater that I made on the Sentro a while ago, and I have a video about it if you would like to watch that. But I used that joining method that I was just talking about to join all of my panels together, and you can like barely see the seam. For the convenience of not having to spend weeks hand knitting something like this, I think having this barely visible seam here is definitely worth it. This is the back of a cardigan that I made a while ago, and I have a video about how to make a cardigan like this if you want to check that out. So with this one though, I did slip stitch this together, and the seam is very invisible. The only thing is it leaves this little like bump here underneath. So when you're wearing it, it might just pucker out a little bit, but it is still pretty invisible. So there are a lot of great options for joining your panels together. So I wouldn't be worried about that if that's something that you need to do to make these garments fit you. It's gonna look great. Or at least the seams aren't gonna be the things that make it look not good. Regardless of all of the sewing and whatever you're gonna have to do on your panels, the Sentro will still be much faster than hand knitting, no matter what. No matter what size you are, anything, the Sentro or any other circular knitting machine is going to be a lot faster than hand knitting, and it's going to be a lot easier on your body. So pros and cons, you know? It's up to your personal preference, but I do think that the Sentro can make very nice looking garments for any body size. It's just, for some body sizes, it's just gonna be a little bit more work. All that to say that it is 100% possible, doable to make garments for larger bodies on the Centro. Well, I think that's all I have for y'all today. If y'all have any more questions about sizing, then leave them in the comments below and I will do my best to answer them. It basically just comes down to making your gauge swatch and figuring out how many panels you need to fit around you, you know, wherever you're trying to fit something. So if you found this video helpful, then please leave a like down below. And if you like Centro content, then consider subscribing. I post a lot of Centro content. I hope you'll have a great rest of your day and I'll see you next time. Bye.